It was a bright and busy afternoon in the city. People were walking quickly along the sidewalks, some carrying shopping bags, others talking on their phones, and the distant sound of car horns filled the streets. The city felt alive, full of movement and noise, but beneath the normal bustle, there was tension. Some people were rushing to appointments. Others were trying to beat the traffic, and the air carried the faint smell of food from a nearby street vendor. In the middle of this scene, a man walked calmly, his posture relaxed and his expression neutral. He had just stepped out of a nearby cafe holding a small coffee cup in one hand and was scrolling through his phone with the other. He was dressed neatly in a simple shirt and trousers and moved with a sense of purpose that made it clear he knew exactly where he was going. People passing by barely gave him a second glance, just another face in the crowd. But there was something about his calmness that stood out amid the rush of the city. Across the street, a police officer was patrolling, keeping an eye on the traffic and pedestrians. He was known among the community as someone who could get impatient easily, especially with people who did not follow his instructions perfectly. His face was stern, his eyes scanning everything around him as if he was expecting something to go wrong. When he noticed the man crossing a section of the street a little too quickly for his liking, he immediately stepped forward, his hand reaching for the man's shoulder. "Hey, stop right there," the officer shouted, his voice sharp and loud. People nearby turned to see what was happening. The man paused and looked up from his phone, surprised at the sudden command. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but just as a natural reaction to someone shouting at him without warning. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to," he started, but before he could finish, the officer's hand struck him sharply across the shoulder. The blow was unexpected, and it made the man stumble a little. He kept his balance, though, and his face did not show anger or fear, only surprise. The people who had gathered around began to murmur among themselves. Some were shocked that an officer would strike someone like that in public, while others immediately pulled out their phones to record the scene. The man straightened himself, took a deep breath, and looked the officer in the eye. There was no shout, no retaliatory move, just calm, quiet composure. Around them, the street seemed to pause for a moment, the usual noise fading slightly as people watched this confrontation unfold. Pedestrians slowed their steps. Car drivers rolled down their windows to see what was happening, and a few brave bystanders stepped closer, unsure whether to intervene. The officer, still standing in front of him, was tense. He pointed a finger at the man and raised his voice again. "You can't just walk like that. You need to follow the rules." The man nodded slightly, still calm. "I understand, officer. I'll make sure I'm careful," he said in a quiet voice. It was almost gentle, the kind of voice that could calm a situation if the other person wanted to listen. But the officer was not listening. He was too caught up in his own frustration, his pride stung by the feeling that someone had disrespected his authority. Without thinking, he raised his hand again, ready to hit. But something in the man's steady gaze made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. People around them began whispering, the sound rising in a low hum. "Did he just hit him?" one person asked, almost unable to believe what they had seen. "Why would he do that?" another muttered. The tension in the air grew heavier, and some people started recording the scene, pointing their phones toward the confrontation. There was a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief on the faces of the onlookers, and everyone could feel that something important was happening, even if they didn't yet understand it fully. The man looked around briefly, noticing the crowd forming. He didn't push them back or tell them to step away. Instead, he seemed aware that their attention was part of the moment, that the public watching made the interaction more meaningful. He took another step back, giving the officer space, his posture relaxed but firm. He didn't move with fear. He moved with the awareness of someone who had faced challenges before and knew how to stay in control. The officer's anger started to mix with confusion. He had expected the man to react with fear, maybe even to run or argue, but this calm, collected demeanor did not fit what he expected. His hand lowered slightly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. He opened his mouth, ready to shout again, but the words didn't come. The man's eyes were steady, calm, and there was a quiet strength in them that seemed to say, "You can't intimidate me." The scene drew more attention as minutes passed. Pedestrians stopped walking, car drivers slowed, and a few people from nearby shops came out to see what was happening. The man did not shout, did not make sudden movements, but the presence he carried made everyone feel that something unusual was taking place. Even the officer, despite his anger, began to feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Someone in the crowd quietly whispered to another, "Who is he?" "I feel like I know him." Another person nodded, eyes wide. I think he's important. Look at how calm he is." The murmurs spread quickly, and soon there was a small buzz of speculation among the bystanders. Some people were recording the interaction, while others just watched, trying to understand what was happening in front of them. The man took a slow, steady breath, keeping his focus on the officer. "I really didn't mean any harm," he said again, his tone measured and calm. "I was just walking. That's all." There was no hint of sarcasm or threat in his voice, only an effort to de-escalate the situation. The officer looked at him, confused by the calmness that seemed so deliberate, so unshakable. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Around them, the city carried on, but the immediate area felt frozen. People were holding their phones, capturing every angle, and some were whispering to each other, discussing the possibility that this man might be someone famous or important. The officer's hand twitched slightly, ready to act, but he couldn't bring himself to strike again. There was something about the way the man carried himself, something about his calm presence that stopped the officer from making another mistake. The tension was heavy. The officer finally spoke, his voice tight with anger and confusion. You need to explain yourself," he shouted. The man simply nodded. "I have nothing to hide. I was just walking down the street. That's all I did." His words were simple, but they carried a quiet authority that made the officer pause. The bystanders began to murmur again, some questioning why an officer would hit someone for simply walking, while others whispered among themselves, trying to identify the man. He didn't look like someone who would attract this kind of attention, and yet, the way he handled the situation drew admiration from everyone around. Time seemed to stretch as the standoff continued. The officer's hand wavered, unsure of whether to act or step back. The man remained calm, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the officer, conveying confidence without aggression. The crowd watched in silence, the energy tense, waiting for the next move. It was in that moment, as the officer's frustration grew and the man's calmness remained unshaken, that someone in the crowd shouted, "Wait, isn't he the mayor?" The words cut through the tension like a sudden breeze, surprising everyone, including the officer. The man paused just for a second, as if acknowledging the remark but not reacting strongly. The officer's eyes widened, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The realization slowly sank in. The man in front of him, the person he had struck without reason, was not just an ordinary citizen. He was the mayor, someone respected and recognized across the city, someone whose calm and collected nature now made the officer's actions look even worse. Panic and embarrassment began to replace the officer's anger, and the crowd's whispers grew louder, buzzing with shock and surprise. The man, still composed, looked around at the people watching, then back at the officer. He did not raise his voice, did not demand an apology immediately, but there was a quiet authority in his stance that made it clear the situation was now serious. The officer, realizing the gravity of his mistake, froze, unsure how to respond, while the people around them recorded and whispered, realizing they were witnessing an event that would be remembered for a long time. The moment had changed. What started as a minor confrontation on a busy street had transformed into something far more significant. The city had stopped for a brief moment, all eyes on the man who had been struck, the calm in the face of chaos, the dignity in the midst of aggression. The man, unaffected by the strike, stood as a symbol of patience, restraint, and quiet power, showing everyone that sometimes the most powerful response is calmness in the face of anger. The crowd had grown slightly larger now. People were whispering excitedly to each other, some holding up their phones to capture every angle of the scene. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew something important was about to unfold. The man who had been struck remained calm, standing tall, his hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. His composure made him stand out, drawing more attention from the crowd, who were now beginning to recognize him. Someone in the back of the group shouted again, "I know him! That's the mayor!" The words spread like wildfire. A few people gasped audibly, while others whispered urgently to their friends and neighbors. "Is it really him?" one asked. "Yes, it has to be," another replied. The murmurs grew louder, and suddenly what had started as a simple street confrontation became a public spectacle. People stepped back a little, giving the man more space, but their eyes were glued to him, curious and tense. The officer's face changed. At first he had been filled with anger and a sense of authority. But now, a flicker of panic appeared in his eyes. His jaw tightened, and his hand, which had been raised moments before, slowly dropped to his side. He took a small step back, as if trying to put some distance between himself and the man in front of him. The officer's mind was racing, his previous confidence replaced by confusion and disbelief. How had he not recognized him? How had he struck the mayor without realizing it? The man looked around at the growing crowd, noticing the mix of shock, curiosity, and a little excitement on their faces. He didn't look angry at the officer, though his calm eyes conveyed seriousness. He was aware of the situation's significance and knew that how he handled it would be remembered. Instead of raising his voice, he spoke quietly but clearly. "Officer, please step back and allow this situation to calm down," he said. His voice was steady, polite, but firm. It carried a quiet authority that made the officer pause once again. The crowd began whispering again. "Did he just tell the cop to back off?" one person murmured. "Yes, and the officer actually listened," someone else replied. Phones were raised, recording everything. People were realizing that this was not just about one person being struck. It was about dignity, composure, and how someone in a position of authority could remain calm even when wronged in public. The officer swallowed hard. He looked around at the faces of the people watching him. Some were frowning in disapproval, some had raised eyebrows in shock, and a few were nodding at the mayor, silently admiring the way he was handling the situation. The officer realized that his actions were being judged by everyone present. The shame and embarrassment began to settle in, a heavy weight pressing down on him. The mayor took a slow step forward, not aggressively, but in a way that showed presence. He made eye contact with the officer and spoke again, his voice calm but carrying the weight of responsibility. "This city deserves better than this," he said. "Everyone here deserves respect, and that includes you, officer, as much as it includes every citizen." The words were simple, yet they held a power that made the officer's stance waver. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the ground before looking back up, unsure of how to respond. Some bystanders had started to approach slowly, not to interfere, but to get a better view. A woman with a small child whispered to the child, "Look closely. That's the mayor. See how calm he is? That's how leaders handle trouble." People began talking quietly among themselves, pointing out the subtle ways in which the mayor maintained his composure. Even the crowd's attention felt like it was part of the mayor's presence, as if his calmness could influence everyone around him. The officer finally managed to speak, his voice shaky. I didn't know. I didn't recognize you. I wasn't aware." His words trailed off. The mayor listened, his face neutral, not showing anger or gloating. Instead, he allowed the officer's words to hang in the air, letting the tension settle naturally. The officer's hesitation and regret were visible, but the mayor didn't use this moment to humiliate him. He understood that this was a teaching moment, not just for the officer but for everyone watching. The crowd began murmuring in approval. Some were relieved that the situation was not escalating into something worse. Others were amazed at how composed the mayor remained, even after being struck. A few people quietly commented to each other, noting that the mayor's calm response made him appear even stronger than the power he held in office. There was no shouting, no anger, no retaliation, just dignity in the middle of chaos. The mayor took another small step forward, looking at the officer with a steady gaze. "It's important for all of us to remember our responsibility," he said. "Everyone who wears a uniform, everyone who serves this city, has a duty to act with fairness and respect. Mistakes happen, but how we respond defines us." His words were measured, deliberate, and full of meaning. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly as he absorbed what had been said. There was no excuse for what he had done, and he knew it. Some of the onlookers began to speak up, but quietly. One man said, "That's right. Everyone deserves respect." Another whispered, He's showing true leadership right here in public without yelling or fighting. The murmurs grew into quiet agreement among the crowd. They were witnessing something rare, a person in authority handling conflict with calm, patience, and grace. The officer's face turned red with embarrassment. He looked around at the crowd recording him, feeling the weight of public judgment. The mayor, meanwhile, kept his calm stance, neither moving closer to intimidate nor stepping back in fear. He allowed the officer to face the consequences of his own actions in that moment. The calm strength of the mayor contrasted sharply with the officer's nervousness, making the situation even more powerful. A few bystanders began asking questions. "Why would he strike him like that?" one whispered. "He must have thought it was just some random man," another replied. "But look at how the mayor is handling it. He isn't shouting or getting angry. He's just standing there, calm, and showing him the right way to behave." The lesson was clear to everyone watching. Sometimes courage is not in fighting back physically, but in staying composed and speaking truth calmly. The mayor noticed the growing attention from the crowd and addressed them softly. "I appreciate that people are watching this. But remember, this is not just about one incident. This is about respect, fairness, and treating each other with dignity every day. We must hold ourselves accountable, and we must expect the same from those who serve us." His voice carried a gentle authority that drew people in. They listened quietly, many nodding as they understood the message. The officer, realizing he could no longer ignore the situation, took a deep breath and finally lowered his hand completely. He looked at the mayor, his expression a mixture of shame, fear, and confusion. He seemed to struggle with how to respond, knowing that the eyes of the city were on him now. The mayor waited patiently, giving him the chance to reflect without pushing him too far or embarrassing him further. The tension in the air slowly began to ease. The crowd relaxed slightly, sensing that the confrontation was moving toward a resolution. Phones were still recording, but the murmuring had changed from shock and disbelief to admiration and quiet approval. The mayor's calm demeanor had influenced not just the officer but also the entire crowd. People were beginning to see a lesson in leadership unfold in real time. The officer finally spoke again, this time with a shaky voice. I'm sorry," he said, almost inaudibly. The words were small, but they carried weight. The mayor nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology but not rushing to forgive. He understood that accountability was part of learning, and this moment was bigger than just an apology. It was about teaching respect and responsibility in a visible way. The mayor then looked around at the people gathered, his calm presence drawing their attention fully. "Let this be a reminder," he said, "that respect is not earned through fear or power. It is earned through our actions, our words, and how we treat each other in moments of challenge. Each of us has the ability to choose patience over anger, understanding over assumption, and dignity over rashness." The crowd listened quietly, absorbing every word. Even the officer looked slightly humbled, finally understanding that his actions had consequences not just for himself, but for the community. The mayor's words were simple, yet powerful, and they resonated with everyone present. In that moment, the street was no longer just a busy city corner. It had become a stage for a lesson in leadership, calm, and humanity. People started to slowly step back, giving the mayor space, but they kept watching. They knew they had witnessed something important, something they would remember and talk about for days. Phones still recorded, but now the videos were not just about a confrontation. They were about dignity, patience, and the strength of remaining calm under pressure. The mayor took a final, quiet breath, maintaining his calm posture. He had not raised his voice, he had not shown anger, and he had not sought revenge. Yet in that calm, measured presence, he had communicated far more than words could convey. The officer remained frozen, aware that the public had seen his mistake and that he would be judged for it. The crowd, meanwhile, slowly dispersed, their minds buzzing with what they had witnessed. Impressed by the mayor's composure and the powerful example he had set in front of everyone, the moment on the street quickly became the talk of the city. People who had witnessed the event shared their videos on social media, and within hours, it was everywhere. Phones buzzed constantly with notifications, and news outlets began picking up the story, adding more eyes to what had already been captured. People from all over the city were discussing the incident, sharing their opinions, and expressing their shock that something like this could happen in broad daylight. In homes, offices, and cafes, people watched the video clips with disbelief. Some shook their heads in anger, wondering how a police officer could strike someone simply for walking. Others admired the way the man had stayed calm and composed, refusing to escalate the situation. The footage was short, but it carried a powerful message. Dignity and self-control could speak louder than any act of aggression. People kept replaying the moments over and over, pointing out the calm strength of the man who had been struck, trying to understand how he managed to remain unshaken. News channels quickly reported the story. "Police officer strikes city mayor in public incident," read one headline. Another article highlighted the irony. A public servant struck another public servant, and the mayor had handled it with a level of calm that seemed almost impossible. Experts were invited to discuss the story, community leaders shared their thoughts, and the city began to grapple with the deeper issues behind what had happened. The mayor, known for his hands-on approach and connection with the community, had become a symbol of resilience and composure overnight. Meanwhile, the officer was under intense scrutiny. Internal Affairs had already been notified by concerned citizens and colleagues who had seen the videos. Calls were made to investigate the incident, and suspensions were discussed. The officer, who had been confident before the confrontation, now faced the reality that his actions were being judged not only by the city, but also by the wider public. He sat at home that evening, watching the videos of himself striking the mayor, feeling the weight of embarrassment and guilt pressing down on him. He realized that no explanation or excuse would erase the fact that he had acted impulsively and unfairly. Across the city, the mayor continued his day as usual, but he was aware that his calm response had gone viral. He received messages of support from citizens, colleagues, and even strangers. People praised his patience, his refusal to escalate, and his ability to communicate respect even in the face of aggression. But the mayor did not let the attention distract him from the larger purpose. He knew this incident was not just about him. It was about how the city could respond to injustice, how public officials could model good behavior, and how trust between citizens and law enforcement could be strengthened. Community leaders began speaking publicly about the incident. They discussed the importance of holding officers accountable, while also promoting understanding and fairness in policing. Meetings were held in neighborhoods across the city, where residents shared their experiences and concerns. Some talked about similar encounters with law enforcement, while others praised the mayor for setting an example. It became clear that the incident had sparked a larger conversation about respect, responsibility, and leadership. Social media became a battleground of opinions. Some people criticized the officer harshly, calling for immediate consequences, while others debated the systemic issues that could lead to such behavior. Many focused on the mayor's calm reaction, noting that it contrasted sharply with the officer's impulsive aggression. Hashtags began trending, and citizens organized online discussions emphasizing the need for change and awareness. The mayor's approach became a model for handling public confrontations with dignity and intelligence. At City Hall, colleagues and staff gathered to discuss the situation. They were impressed by the mayor's ability to handle the confrontation without anger or retaliation. Staff members noted that his composure had prevented what could have been a much more serious incident. Officials began drafting statements for the public, emphasizing accountability, calm communication, and the importance of de-escalation. The mayor insisted that the focus should remain on teaching and learning from the event, rather than personal revenge or shame. The officer, meanwhile, faced an internal investigation. He was required to give a full account of his actions and attend meetings with supervisors. He struggled with understanding how a single act could cause such a ripple effect. While he had expected perhaps a minor reprimand, the reality was much greater. The public had seen everything, and the pressure was immense. He began to understand that his actions had consequences far beyond the immediate moment. They had affected the city's trust in law enforcement, and he would need to work hard to repair that trust. Citizens in the neighborhood where the incident occurred spoke openly about what they had witnessed. Some expressed anger and frustration at the officer's behavior, while others focused on the mayor's example. People talked about how rare it was to see such calm and measured responses in tense situations. Parents explained to their children how important it was to handle conflict without violence, and friends discussed how leadership was more about patience and integrity than power or force. The story became a lesson for everyone, young and old. Local newspapers ran interviews with bystanders who had recorded the event. They described the tension, the shock, and the awe they felt at watching the mayor stay composed. One witness said, "I expected him to shout or push back, but he didn't. He just stood there calm and made everyone around him feel that something was changing in that moment." These personal accounts added depth to the story, showing how one moment of calm could impact many people. The mayor's office released a statement, emphasizing that while the incident was regrettable, it provided an opportunity to address larger issues. The statement highlighted the need for continued education, understanding, and accountability within law enforcement. It also stressed that citizens and officers alike had a responsibility to treat each other with respect. The mayor encouraged dialogue between the community and the police department, suggesting that conversations, training, and awareness were better paths to long-term improvement than anger or retaliation. Meanwhile, the officer began attending sensitivity and anti-bias training as part of the investigation process. He reflected on his actions and realized that impulsive behavior could have serious consequences, not only for himself, but for the entire community. The videos that had gone viral continued to circulate online, serving as a reminder to him and others that accountability was essential in every interaction. He began to understand the importance of self-control, listening and thinking before acting. The mayor, in the following days, visited local schools and community centers, using the incident as a teaching moment. He spoke to students and community members about leadership, dignity, and respect. He shared his perspective on staying calm under pressure and the power of words and actions. People were inspired by his approach, noting that it was rare to see a leader handle aggression with such composure and empathy. His actions encouraged others to reflect on their own behavior and the way they treated those around them. The story continued to spread throughout the city. Citizens talked about how a single moment could become a lesson for many, how leadership was not just about authority, but about the ability to handle challenges with patience and integrity. The mayor's response became a point of pride for the community, showing that calmness, respect, and dignity could prevail even in the face of aggression. People began to see the incident not just as an unfortunate encounter, but as a teaching moment with long-lasting impact. Discussions in community forums, both online and in person, focused on accountability, reform, and personal responsibility. Residents shared their experiences with law enforcement, offering suggestions for improvement and praising those who handled situations calmly. The mayor's example was cited repeatedly, showing that leadership was not measured by how forcefully one could respond, but by how wisely one could act in moments of tension. As the days passed, the city began to feel a subtle shift. People were more aware of their actions and words, officers were reminded of the responsibility they carried, and citizens began engaging in constructive conversations about trust and respect. The incident that had begun on a busy street had grown into a catalyst for reflection and dialogue. It had shown the power of calmness, the importance of dignity, and the way a single moment could ripple through an entire community. The officer, though still embarrassed, slowly began to recognize the lessons from his actions. He realized that accountability was not about punishment alone, but about learning and improving. The mayor's calm, measured response had not only protected the dignity of the moment, but had also set a standard for the entire city. People began to see that mistakes could be corrected, lessons could be learned, and positive change could emerge from even the most uncomfortable situations. In the weeks that followed, the story remained a topic of conversation. Citizens continued sharing their perspectives, praising the mayor's leadership and reflecting on the importance of patience, understanding, and responsibility. The incident became an example of how a single act of composure could inspire thousands, showing that respect and dignity were more powerful than anger or aggression. The city had learned an important lesson. Leadership was not about asserting dominance in every situation, but about maintaining calm, showing integrity, and inspiring others to do the same. The mayor's quiet strength in the face of aggression became a symbol of hope, patience, and the potential for positive change in the community. People remembered that day not just for the confrontation, but for the lesson that emerged from it, a lesson that would resonate for years to come. The city was still buzzing with the news of the incident. People continued talking about what had happened, replaying videos and sharing opinions about the confrontation. The story had grown beyond a street encounter. It had become a lesson in leadership, respect, and accountability. The mayor, as calm as he had been on that afternoon, was now taking careful steps to ensure that the event would result in meaningful change, rather than simply fading away as a viral moment. Inside City Hall, meetings were held almost immediately. Staff members and advisors discussed the importance of responding to the situation thoughtfully. They knew that the mayor's reputation for fairness and approachability made him a trusted figure in the community, but they also recognized that public expectations were high. Citizens wanted to see accountability, justice, and measures to prevent similar incidents from happening again. The mayor listened to every suggestion carefully, considering both the immediate impact and the long-term implications for the city. The officer involved was placed on suspension while an internal investigation began. Internal affairs officers gathered statements from witnesses, reviewed video footage, and started documenting every detail of the incident. The officer had to explain his actions, describing what had led him to strike the man in the first place. He admitted that he had acted out of frustration and impatience, a reaction that had been entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. His words carried guilt and regret, and he began to understand just how serious his actions had been. The mayor called a press conference to address the incident publicly. He spoke calmly and clearly, ensuring that his message reached every corner of the city. What happened on the street was unacceptable, he said. No one should be treated with aggression when they are simply trying to live their daily lives. This incident reminds us all that we have a responsibility to act with respect, patience, and understanding. It is a reminder that we must hold ourselves accountable, and that those who serve the community must do the same. His words were measured and powerful, carrying the weight of authority without anger or blame. The mayor's statement resonated with the public. People appreciated the balance he had struck between acknowledging the wrongdoing and promoting learning and growth. He did not seek revenge or humiliation for the officer. Instead, he emphasized the importance of reflection, education, and improvement. This approach encouraged citizens to think about their own behavior, the expectations they had for law enforcement, and how the city could work together to foster trust and safety. At the same time, community leaders and activists voiced their support for accountability measures. They emphasized that incidents like this, though unfortunate, could serve as turning points for meaningful reform. Meetings were held to discuss ways to improve communication, sensitivity training, and anti-bias programs within the police department. Citizens shared their experiences, often describing similar encounters with law enforcement, and offered constructive suggestions for improvement. The conversation became productive, focused on solutions rather than blame alone. The officer, meanwhile, was required to attend anti-bias and sensitivity training as part of the investigation. At first, he approached it reluctantly, seeing it as a punishment. But as he progressed through the sessions, he began to understand the deeper implications of his actions. He realized that impulsive decisions and assumptions could have serious consequences for both the individuals involved and the broader community. He started to see that accountability was not just about punishment, it was about growth and understanding. The mayor continued to engage with the public, visiting neighborhoods, schools, and community centers. He spoke openly about the incident, explaining how calm responses and patience could prevent escalation and promote understanding. He used his own experience as an example, showing that leadership was not measured by authority or force, but by the ability to act wisely under pressure. Citizens listened, inspired by his words, and began sharing his lessons with others. The media coverage remained extensive. News outlets reported not only on the incident itself, but also on the steps being taken to address it. Interviews with experts highlighted the importance of training, accountability, and community engagement in preventing similar situations. Analysts discussed how the mayor's calm and measured response had prevented further escalation and demonstrated the power of dignity in difficult moments. The story continued to capture attention, reinforcing the public conversation about fairness, respect, and responsibility. As the investigation progressed, the officer began to reflect more deeply. He admitted to himself that his actions had been motivated by impatience, bias, and a lack of control. Watching the mayor remain composed despite being struck made him realize the stark contrast between impulsive aggression and thoughtful leadership. He understood that his behavior had undermined trust in law enforcement and that he now had an opportunity to make amends, not just for himself but for the reputation of the department. The mayor emphasized that accountability must be coupled with learning. He spoke publicly about the importance of addressing systemic issues within law enforcement, encouraging ongoing training, mentoring, and dialogue between officers and the communities they serve. He stressed that every citizen, regardless of status, deserved to be treated with respect and fairness. His words inspired conversations across neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces, with people reflecting on how they could contribute to a culture of empathy and understanding. Meanwhile, the public reaction remained strong. Social media continued to buzz with discussions about the incident, but the tone shifted. Instead of anger and outrage alone, people began sharing stories of positive interactions, examples of leadership, and ways to improve communication between officers and citizens. Citizens praised the mayor's approach, noting that it offered a model for responding to conflict without aggression. Parents used the story to teach children about patience, respect, and how to handle difficult situations calmly. The mayor also met privately with the officer. They spoke openly about the incident, the consequences of actions, and the responsibilities of public service. The conversation was difficult but constructive, focusing on understanding, reflection, and learning. The officer acknowledged his mistake fully and expressed a desire to grow from it. The mayor did not humiliate him but emphasized the importance of accountability, empathy, and responsibility. This private meeting underscored the message that leadership and teaching were more powerful than punishment alone. Community organizations began to organize workshops and seminars on conflict resolution, communication, and de-escalation. Citizens participated actively, sharing experiences and learning from each other. The mayor supported these initiatives, attending some personally and encouraging city officials to take part. These programs aim to prevent future incidents by building awareness, empathy, and practical skills. The city began to see that a single act of calm leadership could spark a broader movement toward understanding and accountability. The officer continued his training, learning how to recognize bias, manage impulses, and communicate more effectively. He reflected on the incident constantly, realizing that his behavior had consequences beyond that single moment. The experience reshaped his understanding of authority, responsibility, and the role of public service. He began to see that trust and respect were earned through consistent actions, patience, and thoughtful engagement with the community. Meanwhile, citizens continued to watch closely. They were impressed by the steps the city was taking, the focus on learning, and the mayor's ability to turn a tense situation into a lesson for everyone. Conversations about leadership, responsibility, and accountability became common in everyday discussions. People praised the mayor not just for handling the street incident, but for using it as an opportunity to teach, guide, and inspire meaningful change. The media highlighted these efforts as well. Reports focused on the training programs, community engagement initiatives, and public meetings that followed the incident. Analysts emphasized that while the confrontation had been unfortunate, it had created an opportunity for growth, reflection, and improvement. The mayor's calm response, combined with structured accountability measures, became a model for other cities facing similar challenges. Over time, the incident began to feel less like an isolated confrontation and more like a turning point. The city had seen the consequences of impulsive aggression, but it had also witnessed the power of calm leadership, reflection, and accountability. Citizens felt a renewed sense of hope that positive change was possible. Officers, too, began to recognize the importance of self-control, empathy, and responsibility in their daily interactions. The mayor continued to emphasize learning over punishment. In public statements and meetings, he stressed that growth, understanding, and reflection were key to preventing future incidents. Citizens, officers, and community leaders alike responded positively, engaging in dialogue and actively seeking solutions. The city slowly began to see a shift in culture, one that valued calm communication, respect, and accountability. As weeks passed, the officer took his training seriously, participating fully and reflecting deeply on his actions. He began to understand that leadership was not about asserting dominance, but about maintaining calm, listening, and acting responsibly. The mayor's example had shown him a new way to handle conflict, and he was determined to learn from it. The city, meanwhile, continued to engage with the broader lessons from the incident. Community workshops, school programs, and public meetings focused on building empathy, understanding, and effective communication. Citizens shared their stories and experiences, creating a culture of learning and reflection. The incident had become more than a viral moment. It had become a catalyst for meaningful change, teaching lessons that would resonate for years. The mayor remained a central figure in these efforts, using his calm presence and thoughtful approach to guide the city. He emphasized that leadership was about responsibility, integrity, and the ability to act wisely in difficult situations. His actions showed that even in moments of personal challenge, it was possible to inspire, teach, and create positive outcomes for everyone involved. Through accountability, reflection, and community engagement, the city began to heal from the tension of that day. The officer learned from his mistakes, citizens learned from the mayor's example, and the broader community began to embrace values of patience, respect, and responsibility. The incident had transformed from a moment of conflict into a lesson in leadership, one that the city would carry forward for years to come. Weeks had passed since the incident on the busy city street, yet the story was far from forgotten. The videos that had circulated online continued to remind everyone of that afternoon, the moment when an officer struck a man, only to discover he was the mayor, and the way the mayor had remained calm and composed throughout the confrontation. For many, it had become a symbol of leadership, patience, and the power of dignity in the face of aggression. The city had changed, quietly but noticeably. Conversations about respect, accountability, and communication had become more frequent. People discussed the importance of empathy not only in the relationship between law enforcement and citizens, but in every interaction in daily life. Parents used the incident to teach their children about calmness and patience. Teachers referenced it when talking about conflict resolution. Even ordinary conversations at cafes and workplaces often turned to the topic of leadership and how one could handle tension without resorting to anger. The officer involved in the incident had returned to work after completing a series of anti-bias and sensitivity training sessions. At first, he had felt defensive, ashamed, and overwhelmed by the public attention. But over the weeks, reflection and education had reshaped his understanding of his role. He now approached his duties with a renewed sense of responsibility, aware that every action he took could affect not only individual citizens, but also the community's trust in law enforcement as a whole. He had learned to pause, to think, and to act with integrity, no matter how stressful the situation might be. The mayor continued his work, but he also made it a priority to connect with citizens more directly than ever. He visited schools, community centers, and neighborhoods across the city, using the incident as a teaching moment. In every conversation, he emphasized respect, fairness, and the importance of listening. He spoke about leadership not as a position of authority, but as a responsibility to guide, inspire, and protect. People were drawn to his message not because of his position, but because of the way he embodied calm and integrity. Even in the most challenging circumstances, public meetings were organized to discuss reforms in the police department and the broader community. Officers attended workshops on communication, bias awareness, and conflict resolution. Citizens shared stories of their experiences, sometimes difficult, sometimes inspiring, but always honest. The mayor participated actively in these sessions, listening, encouraging dialogue, and reminding everyone that real change required both accountability and understanding. The atmosphere was constructive, a combination of reflection, learning, and mutual respect. Social media, which had initially amplified the incident in sensational ways, now became a tool for positive dialogue. Citizens shared stories of kindness, examples of officers who acted responsibly, and discussions about how to improve relationships between law enforcement and the community. Videos and posts highlighted everyday leadership, empathy, and calmness. The incident that had once caused shock and anger had evolved into a platform for education, conversation, and connection. The officer had started volunteering in community programs as part of his personal growth. He attended events designed to foster dialogue between officers and citizens, listened to the experiences of residents, and shared his own reflections about mistakes and learning. Slowly, he began to rebuild trust. It wasn't instant, and there were still whispers and judgments from some community members. But his genuine effort to change and take responsibility began to show. People noticed his commitment, and small steps of reconciliation started to take root. The mayor's approach to leadership became a model for the city and beyond. Schools invited him to speak to students about conflict resolution, respect, and responsible decision-making. Community centers hosted workshops inspired by his calm handling of the incident. Even other cities reached out to learn how this city had managed to turn a tense confrontation into a lesson in leadership and dignity. The mayor had demonstrated that composure and patience could not only prevent escalation, but also create opportunities for reflection and growth. One afternoon, the mayor visited the same street where the incident had occurred. He walked calmly, observing the everyday rhythm of the city, the sounds of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the occasional laughter of children playing nearby. It was a place that had once been a scene of tension, but was now a place of reflection. He remembered the moment clearly: the sudden strike, the shock of the crowd, the officer's hesitation, and his own decision to remain calm. He realized that the lesson extended beyond that single encounter. It was a lesson about patience, understanding, and the way people could respond to unfairness with dignity. The mayor paused to speak with a group of local teenagers who had witnessed the incident and had been inspired by his calmness. He encouraged them to think about how they handled conflict in their own lives, reminding them that leadership was about controlling one's emotions, listening, and acting with integrity. The teenagers asked questions about handling fear, dealing with anger, and making the right decisions under pressure. He answered patiently, sharing insights from his experience both in public office and in personal moments. By the end of the conversation, they were smiling, inspired, and thinking more deeply about the choices they could make in challenging situations. Meanwhile, the officer had completed his reflection and training programs. He had faced the consequences of his actions and had taken steps to grow from the experience. He returned to the streets with a new mindset, prioritizing communication, respect, and awareness in every encounter. His colleagues noticed the change as well. While he couldn't undo what had happened, he could act differently moving forward, making choices that built trust rather than undermined it. The community gradually observed his efforts, and small gestures of goodwill began to rebuild some of the fractured relationships. The incident also sparked conversations in other parts of the city about leadership in everyday life. People began noticing how small acts of calm and dignity could influence larger situations. Parents reflected on the ways they handled arguments with their children. Teachers thought about how to guide students during conflicts. Even business leaders used the mayor's example to promote patience and respect in workplaces. The story had grown into a symbol of how calm, thoughtful responses could ripple through communities and inspire change. The mayor also took time to meet with officers individually, emphasizing the importance of reflection, understanding, and accountability. He didn't just lecture or scold. He guided, listened, and encouraged them to think critically about their actions. He reminded them that being in a position of authority was not about asserting power, but about serving others with fairness and integrity. Many officers were moved by his words and example, recognizing that leadership was a constant balance of responsibility, patience, and self-awareness. In the months following the incident, the city slowly began to feel a sense of healing and transformation. Trust between citizens and law enforcement, which had been strained, started to strengthen. Community programs grew, focusing on collaboration, dialogue, and mutual understanding. Residents, officers, and city officials worked together to prevent similar incidents, creating a safer and more respectful environment. The lesson from that street confrontation, about dignity, patience, and accountability, had become a part of the city's culture,